Good evening, everybody, and Happy New Year. I think I'm allowed to say Happy New Year up until Burns Night. Am I all? Or did I just make that up? I don't really know. Anyway, it's great to see you here on the first of our 5 presentations from the party leaders in Scotland in the Politicians and the Professionals series, which I'm going to say repeats the very successful series we had a year ago, but in fact the political background is very different this year. But again, I'm sure will be a very interesting series of talks. We're again delighted to have the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and the Law Society in Scotland as our sponsors for this series, and we're grateful to them for that. And Martin Potter from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries will chair the discussion after Willie Rennie has spoken. I'm going to step down in a moment and hand over to Willie, but I will pop up right at the very end after the discussion just to invite you all to have a drink with us in the foyer and to network before we leave. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Willie Rennie, the leader of the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ray. It was good to see lots of friendly faces when I arrived. That was until I looked to the back of the room and I saw George Brechin, the former Chief Executive of NHS Fife, and it took me back to a day, I think it was within 5 days of winning the Dunfermline by-election, where I went to his office and demanded a big change in NHS policy in Fife. He can today get his revenge from that event several years ago, but it's good to see you, George, after many years from when you retired in NHS Fife. Last year when I was doing this debate, hopefully you won't have noticed, but I had just incurred an injury to my spine. I had slipped a disc in my back. So those who I thought was particularly stilted last year, that was the reason. But thankfully I've now had an operation to my back, which Natalie, my press officer, was particularly keen to keep quiet because she thought Liberal Democrats getting spine replacements was not a particularly good idea. But now I'm back to fitness and I was running up the hills of Fife at the weekend, so I'm glad to say I'm back fighting fit. I want to thank the David Hume Institute, but all the sponsors as well, for making this happen, this series of debates. Last year, I think the debates were a very useful format for political parties, all in the kind of same format, the same style, roughly the same audience every week, to be able to put forward hopefully serious views and considerations for the year ahead. And I think last year's debate certainly lived up to the mark. There was quite a bit of media exposure on the back of them, but also considerable debate. I think you'll hopefully remember that last year I set out my proposals to ask Ming Campbell to do a second report. You'll remember he produced the Campbell Commission, which set out a series of powers for the Scottish Parliament that have subsequently been delivered through the Smith Commission. But at this event last year, I asked Ming to do a second report to look into the process of delivering those powers. And that, you'll have seen, subsequently had quite a significant impact on the political atmosphere. And hopefully you will see as a result of that and the subsequent events, it's led to quite significant changes in Scottish society and Scottish politics. So this is an important set of lectures, and I hope and I'm sure the other lectures that will be coming after me will live up to that mark as well. Last year my title was In Britain, in Europe, in Work. And I'm going to look briefly back at that issue this year. We in Scotland, thankfully, are still in all three, in Britain, in Europe and in work, but each remains, I regard, at risk from the policy stances of each of my opponents, and I'll explain why. I will take a further look at work and the economy and how we have progressed over the last 5 years since 2010, It has been the most astonishing period in politics and economics that I can remember, and I'm sure that you can remember as well. I will show that how critical it was that politics and economics are linked, that recovery and growth in the UK are linked to the decision of the Liberal Democrats to put the national interest first and to form a stable government capable of tackling the crisis that they inherited. Looking to the future, I will make the case to anchor the next 5 years in the centre ground, that we avoid the return to seesaw politics and seesaw economics. By doing that, I believe that we can continue moving from rescue to recovery. That means we can look to the future, building the kind of country that we all want to see. We need to avoid the mistakes of the past and accelerate our journey in a liberal direction. So I will expand on the hopes that I set out last year for the future development of the Scottish economy and for how future prosperity should be felt by every person, whatever their background. Above all, I will show that the essential liberal offer should be a stronger economy, a fairer society that gives everyone the opportunity to get on in life. So let me start by reminding you of where I left off last year. I chose in Britain, in Europe, in work as my theme. I showed that many of the arguments for Britain leaving the European Union had echoes and parallels in the arguments made by those wanting to leave the UK. That decisions should be made only by the people who live here, and so on. I showed how Britain remaining part of the European Union was important for 3 million jobs across Britain, and how Scotland remaining part of the United Kingdom was important for the 10% of jobs that rely on that single market in Britain, in Europe, in work. The good news is that we are still in all three, and there are 168,000 more jobs in Scotland than compared with 2010, and that's a record number. But all three are still at risk, each from the parties hoping to make gains at the UK general election. Labour still show, and people know it, that they have not learnt the lessons of their mistakes. They let the banks run wild, allowed consumer debt to spiral to £1.5 trillion, and let national borrowing become so high it placed the economy at massive risk when the banking crisis hit. Their plans are still to borrow more than we can afford, putting us all at risk again. And I would say you cannot trust Labour on the economy. The Conservatives risk jobs in 2 ways. They are set upon a lurch to the right that will give us a permanent austerity, slashing jobs in the NHS, schools and essential public services. They want to shrink the state to reach an ideological destination probably only shared with the Tea Party in the United States of America. And they have believed that for some time. But it is the risk that they will take on Europe that risks most jobs. The Conservatives are still in chaos on Europe. The most senior people, from the Prime Minister down, can't answer the straightforward question, and it is this: how will they vote in their own proposed referendum on membership of the European Union? And there is still a risk to Scotland's place in the United Kingdom and to the jobs and prosperity that rely on us being part of the United Kingdom. The SNP want independence by the back door. As a minimum, they say they want a form of ultra-extreme devolution that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world and which would inevitably tip Scotland into independence. They call it Home Rule. But that great advocate of Home Rule, William Gladstone, would be appalled by, I would say, the sleekit redefinition of this liberal policy. William Gladstone was no nationalist, and Alex Salmond is no Home Ruler. But that is not the only risk from them. The SNP have a habit of redefining what an election was about after the votes have been counted. They change, and they change again their position on fundamental issues. That is a strong charge, I would say, for me to make. But look back in 2011 at the Scottish parliamentary elections at that time. The election was all about issues such as the council tax freeze, prescription charges, the bus fares. But after the votes were counted, the SNP said it was an endorsement of the devolution of alcohol excise duties. I can tell you not one single one of the thousands of people, the thousands of voters that I've met on the doors during or after that campaign had said anything about that. They say they don't vote on English matters at Westminster, but now they say that they might. They told us the day before the referendum that it was a once-in-a-generation thing. Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon stood beside a poster saying one opportunity. The day after that referendum, they started planning for the next one. I find it inconceivable that their target to win every single Scottish constituency in May will not result in an attempt by them to get independence by the back door, regardless of what they say now. The former First Minister told newspapers last week he now only wants home rule, not independence. But only 20 months ago, he said that home rule was independence. Well, I'm confused by that, and I'm sure you are as well. And this would be all the more intriguing word game if it wasn't just one ballot paper away from happening. All the evidence is that if you vote for them today, you won't find out until tomorrow what they are claiming that it means. Those who thought that winning the referendum by almost 500,000 votes was enough to put the issue to bed for a generation or even a lifetime need to think again. The Nationalist campaign continues. They will use your vote in May for their cause and not for anything else. We are through the referendum, but the UK is still at risk. We are through the European elections, but Europe is still at risk. We are through the recession, but the economy is still at risk. Still in Britain, in Europe, in work, but all three are still at risk. I said at the start that I would look in some detail at the period of 2010 to 2015. It is a story that begins in May 2010 with a coalition government formed against a backdrop of a sovereign debt crisis sweeping across Europe. Athens was literally ablaze. Italy and Portugal teetering on the brink, and the United Kingdom, with its broken banking system and vast budget deficit, dangerously exposed. It is a story that will record the shared sacrifices that were required to get the economy back on track and the public finances back in the black. And it is a story of those sacrifices beginning to pay off. Remember back to that week of the general election in 2010. The world waited to find out if Britain would get a government at all, if that government was likely to last, and if that government had the capacity to turn around the country's financial situation. Britain wasn't alone. Italy, Portugal and Greece were in turmoil too, as I've explained. But Britain's deficit was the largest in the G20 and the largest structural deficit in the G7. The stock markets were nervous. The international money exchanges were waiting. It was that moment that the Liberal Democrats put the national interest first. So today, employment is at the highest level in the whole of our history. Unemployment is falling, wages are rising faster than inflation, and we have joined the fastest growing economies in the G7. The national interest demanded a government that could tackle the crisis, and we delivered. Liberal Democrats saw the national interest and responded, putting national interest before party interest and staying the course when others repeatedly predicted we did not have the staying power. We took responsibility for Britain's future at one of the most difficult times in our nation's economic history. In the best traditions of our philosophy and our party, not because it would be easy, but because we knew it was right. That is why the international comparison today is so stark. Last week, unemployment in Italy hit 13%. Greece is still in crisis. Yet in Scotland, employment is up 168,000 since 2010. In the last year alone, unemployment has fallen by 44,000 in our country. We have made this progress by creating the conditions for business. We have implemented targeted tax cuts. 68,000 businesses in Scotland are getting up to £2,000 off their national insurance bill. A big boost to small business. Corporation tax will fall to 20% in April, making it the joint lowest rate in the G7. To make work pay, and I'm particularly proud of this, we have cut tax for 2.2 million people and taken 236,000 Scots out of tax altogether. You remember in 2010, the Tories were not interested in these tax cuts for workers. They had a manifesto of tax cuts for the richest, but said tax cuts for the rest of us were unaffordable. These are the very same tax cuts for workers that David Cameron now proclaims, and these are the very same tax cuts for the rich that Nick Clegg has stopped. In 2010, the UK was ranked 14th in the Global Innovation Index. Today, we are ranked 2nd. To go further, the UK government is increasing R&D tax credit rates for SMEs to 230% and to 11% for large businesses. And we're helping the supply of finance as well, with the Green Investment Bank based here in Edinburgh, the government-backed Business Bank, Export Finance, Enterprise Capital, and many other funds. On technology, the UK government is investing over £1 billion in improving broadband and mobile phone infrastructure, with disproportionate sums invested in Scotland. The Technology Strategy Board is investing over £200 million to establish a network of elite catapults, including here in Scotland, with the offshore renewable energy catapult in Glasgow. These are the measures that turn things around. That was the national interest. The recovery wasn't automatic. Look around Europe to see that. We took the necessary steps to balance the books, to give confidence to the markets that Britain was a good place to do business, and we provided the conditions for business to generate jobs and pay taxes for the public services that we all value. We reshaped that economy to make it sustainable, environmental and innovative. Anchoring the economy in the centre ground is how we do it. The economic centre ground argument is not new for Liberals or Liberal Democrats. Russell Johnson, now dear departed, once said, "Liberal positioning in politics is like the nose in relation to the rest of your face, somewhere in the middle and out in front." David Steele wrote in his book, A House Divided, on the 1978 Lib-Lab Pact, "Each swing of the political pendulum threatens to take the country on yet more violently diverse directions to left and to right. The seesaw crashes up and down ever more violently to our discomfort." And as Russell Johnson's metaphor implies, by building a strong economy anchored in the centre ground, we can set out in front an inspiring future for a fairer society where there is opportunity for everyone. The Liberal centre ground prevents the seesaw crashing up and down. So I want to talk a little bit now about how I see the route to prosperity in Scotland in the future. First, let me speak about participation in the economy, as I did here last year. If our country is going to be a success in the 21st century and beyond, then it is going to need the talents and efforts of everyone. If you want a fair society, then no one should be left out of the economy or from their community. Too many are left out at the moment. Even with high employment rates, they can still be higher. Fundamentally, the route to participation is education. It has been the route out of poverty and to a life of achievement for 100 years. The Scottish tradition of education was founded on that notion. We still don't do enough. I have spent the last 3 years as my party's leader, determined to get a big shift in where we have been putting the emphasis as a country. If we are going to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty and remove those stubborn barriers that condemn too many people to the margins, then we have to make a radical change. That's why I've been campaigning about childcare and badgering ministers for more provision for 2-year-olds. Investment in a child's education before the age of 3 is the investment that gets the biggest return. In terms of that child's achievement and the benefits to wider society from them being an engaged and successful part of their community. So I was genuinely delighted that from last August, 8,400 2-year-olds got a free place in education and childcare, and it rises to 15,000 next August. Now, we're still lagging behind England, but we are making progress. Later on in life, we need to make places at colleges and apprenticeships for those who want them. Colleges have been hit hard in their budgets in recent years. We need to support the colleges. There have been more than 1 million extra apprentices across the UK since 2010. The Scottish Government has maintained high levels in Scotland. We can do more to foster a demand for apprentices from companies who don't have them yet. We should help everyone get on in life by supporting more women into science, maths and engineering. And Liberals will always want to overcome the remaining barriers that prevent people from ethnic minorities or LGBT communities from achieving their potential. We have come a long way from the time when people from those groups were cut out of promotion and shut out of opportunities. More and more employers see the value in a diverse workforce that reflects those that they serve and can draw on the biggest pool of talent available. Steps such as equal marriage have started to entrench strong Liberal values. There is still much more to be done. And a final issue of participation is one that I want to take right up the political agenda. That is mental health. It is estimated that 1 in 4 of us will experience mental ill health in our lifetimes. 2.3 million people with a mental health condition are out of work, and research has identified mental ill health as the primary reason for claiming health-related benefits. And we heard just last week how 11,000 local government workers have been absent from work because of mental illness. The human cost is immense, and the economic cost from lost participation is equally large. Despite this, mental health has for too long been the Cinderella service of our NHS. An increase in awareness of costs associated with mental ill health has, by and large, not been matched by increased investment in Scottish mental health services. Just last week, I heard from a constituent who told me that her daughter was self-harming, but had waited 1 year just to see a consultant. That's 12 months from referral from the GP. In those crucial early stages of mental illness, time is critical. That's why I've joined Nick Clegg to putting improving mental health services front and centre of my keynote speeches and priorities. And today I can announce that working with my party's health spokesman, Jim Hume, we will set out on a listening exercise. I want to hear about the problems faced by charities, by people with mental health problems, by councils and by providers. I want to hear about those problems so that we can find solutions which help us prevent mental ill health, tackle stigma and support those with mental health problems. Boosting mental health services will be one of our key priorities. All of these things will create in Scotland an expanded, talented, educated, motivated and healthy workforce. Then we need to make sure there are exciting opportunities available to them. We boost the economy by creating the conditions for business and creating opportunity for everyone using the potential of good education and good health. Scotland has the comparative and technical advantage in big industries like renewable energy, food and drink, and life sciences. We have a high-quality tourism offer, but there are still some big challenges. One of the biggest is that facing the oil industry. Returning briefly to the theme of last year's lecture, I can say that with the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom government, we can be flexible to provide a taxation regime that incentivises industry investment. We can do that without a dramatic impact on the funding of our schools, hospitals, universities and other public services. The UK introduced tax allowances in the autumn statement. In addition to the cut in the supplementary charge and corporation tax, there are new allowances for cluster areas, basin-wide investment and survey exploration. Having discussed the matter with Nick Clegg, Danny Alexander and Alistair Carmichael, I can report there is no lack of political will to take the necessary action to support the industry. The UK government is active on the oil industry. With its broad shoulders, it is supporting this important sector. And for the growth in the rest of the economy, we have to set out some of the steps that we will take. Expanding the British Business Bank so that it performs a more central role in the economy, focusing on long-term capital for middle-sized business. Developing the Business Growth Fund to make it work alongside the Business Bank to meet Britain's shortage of equity capital for growing firms. Supporting innovation through greater public funding on a longer timescale. With a ring-fenced science budget, more catapult innovation and technology centres and a green innovation arm within the Business Bank. Continuing to reform business tax to ensure it stays competitive, making small and medium-sized enterprises the priority for any business tax cuts. Completing the rollout of high-speed broadband to reach over 99% of the UK. Now, as I started off by saying, we should lock in macroeconomic stability, including low inflation, and reduce the risks of a return to a volatile economic environment. Britain needs a stable and competitive environment for growth. This is essential to attract and sustain new business and new jobs. Now, with the general election only months away, the choice of the election is clear. Examining the economic plans, we can see that Labour will borrow too much, risking the economy again. The Conservatives will cut too much, threatening public services and sacrificing the least well off. The SNP want independence by the back door, risking the economy and public services. The Liberal Democrats will borrow less than Labour and cut less than the Conservatives. We will balance the budget by 2018, cut taxes for low and middle earners and ensuring decent public services, creating opportunity for everyone. And that is a very Liberal Democrat message. And it is only a Liberal Democrat message. So the Liberal Democrat approach at every stage on the individual's journey through life helps them participate in a strong economy and a fairer society where they can have opportunity. Childcare and early education, focused on the youngest children, is the best route out of poverty, to break the intergenerational poverty that is, for too long in Britain, has meant that if you are born poor, you are most likely to die poor as well. Strong education that equips every individual to achieve their potential. Skills that pave the way to good job in dynamic industries, the future and in science, green technologies and manufacturing. Mental health services that mean the 25% of people who have a mental health problem during their lifetime do not have to sit on the sidelines of society and the economy. Lower taxes on income to make sure that work always pays and that people on low and middle incomes keep more of what they earn. And personal freedoms that come from a liberal society that means the whole of society can benefit from the talents and contributions of every individual. And I should add, as I promised at the start, that nations and regions and communities will be empowered as never before. Power should be transferred to rebalance the economy away from London. Last year I said that every part of the UK should have nimble governments, able to build on the strengths of their economy and develop the skills and investment needed. I announced Campbell 2, tasked to propose a timetable for the transfer of more powers to the Scottish Parliament. Despite initial opposition to a joint approach from Labour and the Conservatives, there was astonishing and rapid progress. The Liberal Democrats had already set out our plans in Campbell 1. Last spring, Labour and the Conservatives set out their ideas. The Secretary of State for Scotland agreed to host the different parties once the referendum was completed. Holyrood leaders signed up in August, Westminster leaders in September. And that meant that on the 19th September, Lord Smith could start his work. It was the Liberal Democrats who set out the pace on the negotiations too, with our idea to create a Scottish welfare system for the first time. The Smith Commission, published on schedule, all 5 parties, for the first time ever, signed up, all 5 in the one room, to agree our constitutional future. I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister this morning in London and can report that the clauses are now due in a fortnight. You heard it here first. From Campbell 1 to Burns Night clauses, I am proud of the pace of reform that we have set. We have shown the way, we have persuaded others to join us, and we have delivered. And I think that perhaps sums up what I have been speaking about this evening. In government, we've proved our commitment to building a stronger economy by tackling the budget deficit, helping create business, create 2 million jobs, including 168,000 in Scotland, helping create record numbers of new apprenticeships and freezing fuel duty. In government, we've proved our commitment to make Britain fairer by cutting income tax by £800 for 24 million low and middle earners, ensuring the biggest ever rise in the state pensions and giving thousands of 2-year-olds free childcare every week. We have proved in government we stand for fairness by blocking the Conservatives' plans to run schools for profit, allow employees to be fired without cause, and to pay public servants less if they live outside London. That record of action allows us to set out with confidence our campaign for the future. Over the next 5 years, the Liberal Democrats in government will balance the books while raising the income tax threshold, giving workers and pensioners a further £400 tax cut, increasing spending on the NHS across the UK, which will add money available for health in Scotland, with mental health and local services being the top priority, and devolve more power from London to Scotland to rebalance the economy and create a fairer country. The Liberal Democrats will have both the commitment to devolution and the influence at Westminster to ensure Scotland gets the powers that we have been promised. And that is why I have been able to say that only the Liberal Democrats can be trusted with both a strong economy and a fair society, giving opportunity for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Willie. Perhaps I should start by thanking the David Hume Institute as well for inviting me to chair this evening's Q&A session. The Institute of Faculty of Actuaries is delighted to be a sponsor of this winter series of seminars again, so well done to you to accepting the challenge to be first on in that series of our politicians and professionals events. We do indeed live in interesting or unprecedented times of opportunity, as Willie told us this evening. We had the excitement last year of the referendum, followed in record time by the Smith Commission report, and you heard it here for the first time this evening. In a fortnight, I think you said, that the Burns Night draft bill that follows up from that. But the excitement won't stop there. There'll be a general election later this year, and next year beyond that, Scottish parliamentary elections. So with all those exciting changes and challenges ahead of us, I'm sure you've got absolutely loads of questions stored up for Willie on what he set out for us this evening, on the sort of Scotland that the Liberal Democrats wish to create, anchored in that central ground, I think he told us. So we've got 30 or 40 minutes or so. What I'll try and do is I'll take questions in pairs, if that's all right. So perhaps by way of format, before you ask a question, if you could say who you are, who you represent, and we'll take it like that. So hands up for first questions, please. So gentleman there, and one in the front as well.
Thank you. My name's John Aldridge. I'm just representing myself, I suppose. I wanted to ask something about your positioning of the party in the centre ground. Given that we're faced with a Conservative Party bent on drastically reducing public services and intruding more into people's lives, a Labour Party with a dismal record on human rights and civil liberties, and an SNP pursuing an aggressively centralist agenda, is there not a risk that by positioning yourself in the central ground, you get dragged to the right and the authoritarian side of the spectrum represented by the other parties?
And the second question?
Thank you. Thomas Ward, representing myself as well. Over the next 3 or 4 years, the Scottish Parliament is going to start taking effect of a whole range of further powers, particularly in respect of taxation, but in some other areas as well. How do you see the exercise of these new powers coming to change the terms of the political debate in Scotland?
Thank you.
I think you can see, John, by the reaction of the Daily Mail, what a liberal effect we're having on the government. I mean, just today, Nick Clegg spoke about the Conservatives' attempts on the back of what's happened elsewhere in the world to try and get the Snoopers Charter reintroduced. I think you've seen in Scotland by our efforts on stop and search, which is higher, 5 times higher than in the rest of the UK, which is astonishing considering the trouble that they've had on stop and search south of the border. Guns being carried by the police, the whole centralisation issue of the police. So, although the kind of politics has got several different dynamics, isn't it? It's got the left-right dynamic on the economy, it's got the liberal authoritarian dynamic, and you're not always bang centre on all of those dynamics. What we are is very liberal and will continue to be so. In terms of the economy, we're keeping it right in the centre ground because we can't have that seesaw. So it depends which dynamic you're talking about. And increasingly with the nationalist, internationalist dynamic as well, we're on a different part of that spectrum as well. So it depends on which dynamic you're talking about as to whether we're in the centre or not. But certainly on liberal issues, we've not been afraid, despite the fact that it's not necessarily a popular position to adopt sometimes. And it's quite difficult to stand up, especially in circumstances like just now, against kind of more demands to try and keep us safe, when actually all it's doing is diverting resources from where it should be focused on by having a much more targeted approach to these issues. I don't know, you probably didn't see, Thomas, the debate on the land and buildings transaction tax in the Scottish Parliament. If you did, I would urge you to get another life. but if what you would have noticed if you did watch that is how the dynamic changed completely. Because up until that point, in all the debates on finance in the Scottish Parliament, it's all been about how can we spend the money that we've got, the extra money that we've got. It's all about public services. It was all about the public service side of the balance sheet. But just within that one instance, in that one debate, it changed completely. We had to think about the people who were paying for those services as much as those people who were going to receive those services. And it had a dramatic effect for a tiny tax, really small tax. It's had a dramatic effect on the chamber. Now, you can see if we can get The income tax, you know, you can get, I mean, the VAT is effectively just a ban it by any other route, but nevertheless we'll get the proceeds of growth on VAT. But if we can get the income tax, I think it will just change the dynamic in the Parliament completely. Because we're not a rounded Parliament just now, and I think with raising the majority of the money we spend, which was the principle that we were trying to achieve with the Smith Commission, I think we will be able to get to a position where all the MSPs have to think not just about how they're going to spend money, but how they're going to raise it as well. Does that help?
Next pair of questions. I've got 2 more hands there, please.
Evening, Willie, and it's Ben Thompson.
Hi, Ben.
From the Campaign for Scottish Home Rule and from Scotland. The sort of obvious question, I mean, the Liberal Democrats have been the party of Home Rule. I mean, you got the bill through in 1913 for Scottish Home Rule, which had it not been for the war, would have become Scottish Home Rule. I think Calman has seen a great initiative for politicians who actually come together to agree something, but it is a compromise and doesn't really have had any public consultation because it was done in 4 weeks and there were 700 odd submissions that had to been read a day to be able to cope. What I wanted to ask you as a Liberal Democrat is what are the guiding principles that really do make up Home Rule? Because it seems as though the First Minister is trying to set out a version of Home Rule, but I haven't yet got a clear set of principles of where it ends for the Liberal Democrats and what it is that you're trying to achieve beyond this compromise that Smith has put forward. So what are the guiding principles, Willie, of Home Rule as you see it?
And the second question?
Charlotte Barber, I'm speaking for myself. I was interested in your comments on income tax and how it will bring a different sense of purpose to the Scottish Parliament. Once we've got all the income tax devolved, or the rates and bands devolved to Scotland, how will UK MPs still be accountable to their electorate at Westminster for reserve powers?
Okay. I mean, for me, Ben, it's always been about I mean, if the Scottish Parliament wants to do something different, it should have the ability, the flexibility, it should be nimble enough to be able to do it itself. And I think what was missing before is on the tax raising power. So we can decide how we're going to slice up the cake, but we weren't able to decide how big the cake was going to be or how small the cake was going to be. So therefore, we weren't really able to do something different. And so too often we were able to point to somebody else and say they're stopping us from making that progress. So having that kind of independence within the United Kingdom is something that I was desperate to secure. And for me, raising the majority of the money we spend was the first important principle in order to achieve that. The second one was entrenching the Scottish Parliament to make it a more equal partner within the United Kingdom. And we've achieved that through the Smith process as well. We've got, with the changes to the Sewell Convention, to entrench them. That means that the Scottish Parliament has to be consulted as part of it. And it effectively has got much more power, permanency within the United Kingdom setup, so it's much more of an equal partner. The joint ministerial committees, which sound very technical and boring, but actually give a formulated way for the Scottish Government to be part of debates on a wide range of areas, much wider than we have just now, on an automatic basis. I think that also meets that requirement. Now, how far do you want to go? I think the public know that if the Scottish Parliament can do something different on the domestic agenda, it'll have met their needs. Because they still want to share pooling of risk and resources across the United Kingdom. They still want that, and that's what they decided in the referendum last year. But they want to be able to do, if they want to do things differently on the domestic agenda, they should be able to do so. Now, if they can achieve that, people will have judged it to be enough. And for me, I think we have got to the right kind of settlement. Of course, you could tweak at the edges with different things, but I think we've got the right settlement. I think what needs to change now, in order to achieve the federalism that I'm after, is changes in the rest of the UK. Because then I think we'll get a much more balanced relationship across the United Kingdom. Now, my belief is that it will be so attractive, what we've got in here, that the rest of the UK will want it. That's my belief and hope. Hopefully it's not unrealistic. Because I know the United Kingdom, having lived in Cornwall for 7 years, is a complicated place. Cornwall still regards Devon as England. So it was quite a difficult concept to try and understand how do you get some kind of federal structure that you've not imposed in the aftermath of a war. So it's a difficult thing to get, and it's going to be piecemeal and incremental, but I think it will come within time, and I think the referendum ensured that Britain won't be the same again. But I think the major changes that I want to see now, the biggest steps on things like House Lords reform and changes throughout the rest of the United Kingdom to the structure of governance. And I think city deals might be part of the answer with some of it, to build upon those structures. It shouldn't be a top-down imposition, it needs to be bottom-up, but I think it will come. I'm pretty confident about that. In terms of how do MPs, Scottish MPs, have a role in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom constitution is a bit of a mess, and it does need to be resolved. Now, does that mean that you're going to get perfection every step along the way? No, you're not. And we shouldn't attempt to do it, because that's the forces of conservatism allow that, means that they use that as an excuse not to do anything at all. Now, I think actually by getting the powers of the Scottish Parliament that we're going to get, I think that will force changes in the rest of the UK. I think it will require the rest of the UK to be bolder in dealing with the problems that that creates as a result, which will force the pace of change or reform in all the other areas. So just because it's not perfect in terms of what the Scottish MP's role at Westminster is, doesn't mean we should pull back in Scotland. They should be bolder. And that's been my argument throughout to the Labour Party, which was an argument that Gordon Brown was proposing in the aftermath of the referendum about being bold and timid at the same time. So that is my argument. I think, for what it's worth, the Liberal Democrats proposed a change to the EVO process, that if you're going to have English votes for English laws, then you should do it like any other devolved reform, and that should be on a proportional representation basis. Now, not unsurprisingly, the Conservatives and Labour are not too keen on that idea, and they don't want to have EVO on a PR basis, because then they think they lose out. But that's the kind of change that they're going to have to embrace if they're going to get a sustainable constitutional settlement for the UK.
Willie, can I just take you back to the Home Rule question? I think you said that actually the settlement is pretty close to the Liberal Democrats' handbook for Home Rule, as it were. Where then do you feel the greatest area, if any, of compromise had to be made in the Smith Commission process that you were part of course?
We did. There was a bit of give and take on various things, because when you get down to should tribunals be administered or legislated in Scotland, it gets to quite a techie kind of level where you do kind of compromise, but it's not really a political compromise. Anyway, so when you get into that and British Transport Police and all those things, it's not really the big political compromises that we should be concerned about. I actually think we added to the process. We heard people during the referendum. We understand that they wanted more. They wanted a big package, and the only way you were going to get a big package is doing what we did on welfare. Now, bearing in mind, in the welfare proposals in Ming Campbell's report were to transfer the administration of the work programme to the Scottish Parliament. That was the extent of what we said should happen. Now we have got a Scottish welfare system worth £2.5 billion. In fact, it's worth £3 billion if you take the money that's already under the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament. We'll be able to create new benefits. We'll be able to do topping up on other benefits. The flexibilities, we've got the universal credit, and we've also got the non-universal credit items that have been devolved. So we've actually gone further than any of the unionist parties said they were going to do on welfare and on many other areas. So if we've compromised up rather than compromised down. I was keen that there wasn't a lowest common denominator. And we've managed to achieve that. So I think it's a big package. The big area for manoeuvre now is on getting the rest of the UK to shape up.
Okay, thank you. Next couple of questions. One at the back right, and I saw this one just afterwards.
George Brechin. Nothing to do with anything that's been said. If I cast my mind forward to this series of speeches in 2016. Can I invite you to give us a trailer for what your manifesto will say for 2015 and 2016 in terms of devolving powers from the Scottish Parliament to councils and other public bodies within Scotland.
Ian Doig, and again I'm an independent. Mr. Rennie, thanks for a very thoughtful presentation. I agree with an awful lot of what you said. However, you were stronger on criticising the other parties than you were on what your policies will be. I'm clear where you want to get to, but I'm not clear how you're going to get there. So I agree with you that the answer is not further great tranches of austerity cuts, and nor is the answer great amount of further borrowing, but I'm not quite sure what your solution is. I favour the Scandinavian economy model, where you have a high level of growth, high level of salaries, high level of public services, sustained by high level of taxes. But how would you get, do you agree with that? And how would you like to see you get there? You said you want to balance the budget by about 2018. How would you get there?
So we're going to get a manifesto preview as well, are we, tonight?
Yeah. George, first of all, it is an important part that there is actually been increasing centralisation in Scotland at the same time as there have been demands for more powers to the Scottish Parliament. And you've got a situation now where councils are basically instructed to run services. That's been the case in the NHS for many, many years. There's not really been that much local power in many areas, but that has also become the case within councils, and that needs to change. The same principle I would apply to the Scottish Parliament should be applied to councils. They should be able to raise the majority of the money they spend. They should have true flexibility on the council tax. That doesn't mean I'm against the freeze. It just means that councils should decide. I attended a debate at a COSLA conference where Sarah Boyack and Nicola Sturgeon were sitting on either side of me, bitterly arguing about whether the council tax should be frozen or not, when actually the people in the room who should be making the decision were the people in the room who were listening to this debate. And that's the state of local democracy now, that national politicians debate local politics, when it should be local politicians who do that. We're in favour also of creating the ability for councils to assume greater powers, to have borough councils. So, for instance, if Auchtermuchty decides that it wants to have a borough council and it wants to run its services in its community, then it can receive a precept from the council to pay for that, and it can take responsibility itself, actually trying to devolve powers even further down from the remote council in Glenrothes. So there's a flexibility in that area as well. So we're very keen on making that kind of change. Now, when you start getting, I avoid all the issues about boundary reviews and that, because I always think it's a distraction. It's actually about trying to get services to work together, because you're going to have boundaries no matter where you draw the line. So it's about the way that we get services to work together, and the politicians to set the priorities within councils to make sure that that's possible to do. That's the best way of trying to get the reform that we're needing to have. But ultimately, central government should stop meddling in the way that local government operates, and they should just allow them to breathe and do it themselves. I thought I had set out quite a number of proposals of what we had done and what we were going to do. Mental health, childcare. I talked about the need to make sure that we're creating an atmosphere for business and small business and science, technology, the environment, and renewables. We've done an awful lot on incentivising the renewable sector, and we'll continue to do that. But we're not in favour of a dramatic change towards a Scandinavian system. We're not in favour of massive increases in taxation. It hasn't been the British way. We're somewhere stuck between America and Scandinavia in that kind of model. And we want that kind of stability. So it's a good place to do business, but it's got standards so that we've got that fairer society that's integral to it. But the main route, in addition to that, is making the most of our people. And because we've got so many people who've got mental health problems or are destined to be in poverty for their whole life because they're born into poverty, I think that, in addition to the business measures that we're taking, that balanced approach of not borrowing lots more, because Labour are proposing not to balance the books until the end of the next Parliament. The Tories want to go much further and create surpluses, which will have a dramatic impact on public services that are already creaking under the strain. So we're choosing that kind of centre ground, which we think is a sensible way to proceed, prioritising capital investment
for the future. So if we're going to borrow, it's borrowing for great social good for the longer term. But it's that very liberal approach to it is what we're trying to do. So I will send you my manifesto now, and I will follow up with a knock on your door to make sure you've read it.
Two questions here on the right, please.
Thank you. John Elliott. Was it politically astute, as Brian Moncrieff suggested in a column in The Scotsman yesterday, of Jim Murphy to promise to fund 1,000 more nurses in Scotland by the proceeds of the mansion tax in London? Or was it in fact, as the unholy alliance of Diane Abbott and Boris Johnson said, completely bonkers?
Who's next?
There was a second question there. Microphone is just on its way.
If I'm right, John Whiteman, if I'm right in thinking the policy of your party is for a federal United Kingdom, or was, do you see more coming unilaterally to Scotland at present as helping that, or could potentially threaten it?
I mean, we're in favour of a mansion tax as well. I think it was in part the way that Jim described it, and he did it on purpose. Because actually, he encapsulated what the United Kingdom meant in a very short, provocative press release. We're going to take money from people with big hooses in London to pay for nurses in Scotland. I mean, that's basically what he was saying. Now, that's always been, well, it's been for some time, the Labour Party policy, but it was the way that he was able to describe it that really just set it going. Now, I don't think Diane Abbott, who called him Jeremy Murphy, was really on strong ground, because it has been the policy, as I say, for some time. But Jim has got an ability to describe things in a way that I think has been very helpful to the Labour Party, because he has been able to set the agenda for the last, well, since he's become leader. I mean, it's been quite spectacular how he's managed to do it. I'm not saying I agree with everything that he's saying, but I do admire, the way that he's gone about it with great energy, and I think that's good for Scottish politics that he's doing that. John, we are in favour of a federal United Kingdom. We actually think that devolving the powers to Scotland, we're trying to move away from the word devolve, because that implies superior, inferior. We're trying to move towards transfer to the right places. But we believe that kind of transfer will actually inspire the rest of the United Kingdom, provoke the rest of the United Kingdom, attract, encourage, whatever, the rest of the United Kingdom to embrace similar changes, so that they get as kind of excited as we do about the ability to do things differently for their area. Now, the excitement that's around city deals is really interesting. Manchester, I've never seen people, because people in Manchester talk about things, for instance, like London having too much power and control, that kind of siphon, that hoover that the London economy is, that it keeps attracting people and money and skills and resources, and the house prices keep going up, and all that kind of vicious cycle. They talk about that, and they're as frustrated about that as we are. And they're excited by the prospect of city deals being able to rebalance that economy. I mean, Vince Cable talks about that kind of hoover kind of economy of London and the South East. He's desperate as a London MP to try and deal with it, because we want to create a balanced United Kingdom. So if we can decentralise economic power as well as political power across the UK, I think that would be a good thing. And I think what they see in Scotland is what they'll want for their area too.
Thank you. Question at the front, and lady in the green jacket.
Hi, Mark McLaughlin from the Press Association. Going back to what you were saying about the Snoopers Charter, and I want you to frame your question in a more Scottish context, given that the investigation and prevention of crime is devolved. Do you think Police Scotland is fit for purpose to investigate and prevent a crime such as what we've seen in Paris, given that you were instrumental in limiting their ability to carry guns, and you would also limit their ability to investigate the crimes through monitoring communications?
Thanks, Mark. Who's next?
I'm Kyla Brand. I'm a trustee of the David Hume Institute and also a trustee of the Mental Health Foundation. And in that context, very much welcome the comments you've made and the listening exercise that you're embarking upon. I'm sure we'll talk further. But actually, my question is about Europe, because there is obviously, you've referred to the risk that continues, but I think there are some very interesting political influences here, and one in which it would be interesting to know the role of the Liberal Democrats' view in terms of a forthcoming referendum on the membership of Europe, and what you would anticipate would be the consequences for Scotland in Europe after that kind of referendum. Thank you.
Mark, yeah, I mean, I've got faith in Police Scotland. I think the professionalism of the officers, the way that they've coped with the reform over the last 2 or 3 years is impressive. I think they've carried themselves with great dignity. They're under extreme pressure, but they've carried themselves with great dignity. And I think they have got the tools and the assets and the skills and the intelligence networks to be able to keep us safe. So I'm not going to run down Police Scotland. I just think we should make their job easier by not imposing centralisation measures that don't really make things that much better. In fact, make them an awful lot worse. And getting them involved in stopping search procedures that are completely distractive and don't allow them to focus on the real crimes, or giving them targeting measures that means that they are again distracted from the main focus of what their job should be. If we're going to train and pay police officers, then we should allow them to do their job with their own intelligence and judgment and discretion, and that has been stripped from them. So I've got faith in Police Scotland to keep us safe. I think they work very well with the United Kingdom operations, and I think no matter what debates politicians have about the edges of their powers, I think they will always continue to do a professional job. So I'm afraid I'm not going to give you the answer that you want. In terms of Europe, I mean, we will be very unashamedly pro-European. It's not necessarily what everybody believes in the United Kingdom. I think everybody's probably got some kind of criticism of the European Union, and we all express some of that about the need to reform and make it more democratic and responsive, that it shouldn't automatically be assumed that you pull powers into the centre, that governments and local governments in particular should have greater responsibilities and that flexibility to do it. But at the end of the day, it means 3 million jobs for the British economy. And I think most people at the end will make a decision about the pragmatic benefits for their way of life and their economy. And I think, therefore, people will decide to stay in the European Union. I think it will be a rocky ride. I think you'll have some populist forces that might try and drive us out. But I think at the end of the day, people will embrace the European Union for what it means. Now, I think the original objective of the European Union to keep us safe, to avoid future wars, has been obviously successful. But people don't value that as much because it has been successful. I think it comes down to the economy and jobs. Now, what it means for Scotland, if we were, to end up, in a position where we're outside the European Union, I think it would be catastrophic. I think our economy is linked to the economies of the European Union. Now, it's not been great for us over the last few years, because when they get into financial difficulties, we feel the effects of that as well. And that's why we need to stick together, no matter how difficult it is at times. I think we need to stick together. Now, obviously, you're going to have different speeds of Europe, because you've got some that are in the Euro and some that are not, and probably won't be at all for many, many years at least. So you'll have a need for the European Union to be flexible enough to cope with those two sorts of equal members, and one should not be regarded as more important than the other. But that's something that pro-Europeans like myself, are struggling with, about how you make sure that that's the case, that you don't just get left in the sidelines from the big debates that are happening in Europe. But I think it's important that we do get through the next few years, because the European project is too important to lose. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Willie, you mentioned populist forces in that European debate. How do you see that debate playing out differently here in Scotland and south of the border then?
We shouldn't assume that we are any more pro-European than the rest of the United Kingdom. I know we always think we're more socially just, liberal, left-wing, pro-welfare, pro-immigration, pro-Europe. But if you look at the opinion polls, and John Curtis backs this up, we're not that different. We're pretty much the same now. Probably the depth of feeling might be different in some areas, but actually we're not very much different, and we need to reflect that. And I think the political classes in Scotland are sometimes out of touch with what the opinion is. I know exactly where public opinion is because I'm knocking on doors 3-4 times a week. I know what's happening. But I'm not sure everybody necessarily does understand what's going on. So I think it's important that we do understand what people are feeling. So therefore I think the debate in Scotland will also reflect that scepticism about Europe. So we need to work just as hard as those of our colleagues in the rest of the UK, making sure there's a vote in favour of staying, because we shouldn't automatically assume that it would be a yes vote.
Thank you. A couple more questions. Lady at the front and gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Louise Miron, representing myself. With all these new tax-raising powers and finance powers coming to the Scottish Parliament and possibly even being devolved further down to councils, do you think that there is the expertise in the Scottish Parliament, the technical skills and technical knowledge in dealing with tax design, unintended consequences of tax policy, understanding of macroeconomic policy, etc. Do you believe that there is the expertise in-house to deal with these new powers?
Hi, I'm Rufus. I'm from London, but I'm studying up here in Edinburgh. I'm obviously delighted that I'm paying 9,000 and my flatmate's paying nothing. I was wondering, are there any plans to make that fairer at all?
See, we were doing so well. We were doing so well. Nice questions about Europe and home rule and all that, and then you have to come up with a question about tuition fees. My favourite subject. Let me deal with Louise's point first then. Yes, I think there is the expertise, but I think the Revenue Scotland experience should maybe tell us that sometimes these things are quite hard to do. In fact, they're behind schedule, and they've got this alternative measure in place, this backup plan to do a paper-based system. That should give us some kind of food for thought about how easy these things will be to do, and we shouldn't automatically assume it will be sorted. But there is the expertise there, and the Scottish Government has shown, through from 1999 all the way through, the civil servants are incredibly professional and will get the job done at the end. It's just the politicians need to give them the space and the time and the schedules to be able to do it effectively and not automatically assume that Scots automatically do it better. So I think that's where I think the caution needs to be, but there's no doubt there is the expertise, and I've met many of the people who are running these new services and taxes, and I know they can do this job if they're given the time and the flexibility to do it. Rufus, the whole issue of tuition fees, it's obviously a difficult issue for us as a party. We've got a bit of a record on this one. I can't see an awful lot changing in tuition fees policy. I think the one area that we might see some flexibility is around about the student loan repayment levels. It's far more restrictive in Scotland. In England it's 21,000, and there is the capacity to change that so that people can repay their loans over, when they're earning higher levels, and pay over a longer period of time. So that's one of the areas that we could look at. I cannot see this policy being reopened again, and I think it will remain as it is. It's not been, there are still, you're here, and many of your friends from south of the border continue to come as well because of the excellence of the university sector up here, I assume. So it's not been that much of a deterrent in those ways. But what it has had is that you find in England the supportive measures for those from lower income backgrounds are far, far superior. The grants that are available from those from disadvantaged backgrounds are better. And that's something that Scotland's fallen behind on, and we might see the effects of that in future years as it's more of an exclusive experience to get into university in Scotland, because actually still the prospect of paying your living costs is quite extensive rather than getting a job. So I think that's another area that the Scottish Government will need to look at if it's going to be the progressive force that it wants to be. But I can't see the whole issue of fees being reopened. Thank you for the question.
Next couple of questions, please. One here and one on the right-hand side.
Kevin Lang from the Law Society of Scotland. Willie, I'm conscious that we were, in Scotland at least, much more used to the concept of coalition government. But when it happened at Westminster, it was obviously a big, big change in terms of a UK context. And as we come to the end of this 5-year term, I'm interested to know if you think that there are any, or what the positive legacies that you see there might being following on from 5 years of a coalition government, but also what are the lessons that perhaps need to be learned if and when, as is expected, there may be another hung parliament after May and potentially another form of either minority government or coalition partnership government, what the lessons are from this term?
My name is Muir Russell. I don't represent anyone. And by coincidence, the question I was going to ask is very similar to that. On the assumption of a hung parliament, can you tell us just what would be the 2 or 3 real, clear, red line issues for the Lib Dems in any or all of the coalitions that might be on offer?
You're almost as bad as Mark at the front. And you're not a journalist. But obviously with great experience in these areas. I mean, we won't reveal any kind of bottom lines, red lines, negotiating position in advance of any referendum. It partly depends, of any election. It partly depends on what the debate is during the campaign, what the priorities that people have for individual issues, the votes for each of the respective parties and how they've perceived the campaign as well, who's up, who's down, the mood. All these issues have a dramatic effect, as I'm sure you've seen directly yourself from being involved in these negotiations. They have a dramatic effect on the kind of conduct of negotiations. So therefore that will have a big impact. So I couldn't say what the biggest, what the priorities will be. I know that we've said taxes, childcare, pensions, keeping the economy in the balance, making sure we've got the right levels of borrowing, capital investment. Those are all the things that we're talking about as priorities, and we'll continue to press those things. How much you get of those will depend on how much of a vote you get and what the other party is in response to that. So Kevin, I mean, Tim, I think I suppose my concern is that people might think that coalition is not something that parties should try and work towards. I think there is a benefit of providing that kind of certainty and security and stability from having a coalition of parties working together and resolving and having a very steady influence on the governance of a country. I think people underestimate the potential difficulty that you can have from running a minority administration, of not knowing from one week to the next whether you're going to be able to get your programme through. Sometimes things outside the immediate debate that you're having can have a dramatic impact on that debate, completely irrelevant to it, but it has a dramatic impact on the stability in the country. People also underestimate the power, the executive power that governments have, which you don't need Parliament to endorse. It's only when you're doing the legislation side and perhaps the scrutiny and confidence votes and budget votes that really that you have a requirement to go to Parliament. But if you've got a very slim legislative programme, you could do an awful lot by yourselves, as Alex Salmon knows. But if you see Bruce Crawford, he got greyer and greyer as the Parliament went on, because he was having to negotiate every single week to make sure he had a majority. It wasn't easy. They say it was easy, but it wasn't. So actually, if you've got that stability of two parties working together, it gives security and stability for the country. So I think that's one of the big lessons that I fear might be lost, is that you do have advantages in working together. I think the country still hasn't really come to terms with the fact that if you don't get a majority, then if you don't have most MPs, if you don't have the biggest group of MPs, you can't get it all your own way. and people are finding still that difficult to understand. They automatically think you're ditching your principles if you don't deliver absolutely everything that you said you're going to do. The fact that we've only got 8% of the Parliament just seems to get no recognition. So I think those are the kind of people haven't quite got how coalitions work yet, and I think that will come over time. But I think the security and stability that you get from a coalition is something that perhaps we might underestimate, and I think people will come to regret if they do dispense with it.
I think you covered both the questions in one go there, didn't you? But
nice try, Muir.
A couple more questions, please. Probably got another 5 minutes or so. One there, and one at the back. Ben again.
Hello, Ian MacDonald, again representing myself. Something you haven't spoken much about this evening, or even obliquely, is the question of immigration. And it's tied, of course, to the other matters of Europe, but most of all, it's a worry about what's going to happen at the ballot box by the people who'll be attracted by the immigration's policies of UKIP. What is the Liberals' strategy for trying to keep from losing votes to UKIP?
Sorry to have another go, but it's an entirely different question this time, which is how realistic is it for all of the parties to try and get down to beneath £30 billion by 2018? And I only say that because before the last election, all three major UK parties claimed that the deficit needed to be cut by about 10 billion, but within a few weeks after the election, they were all talking about 50 or 60 billion. So rather pandering to what the public wanted to hear, this election, they seem to be fighting on the basis to get to a balance by 2018. Currently, the deficit is 100 billion. That means cutting 70 billion, which is about 15% of what you raise in taxes. So that's going to have to come off costs. If the NHS and various other areas are going to be protected or even increased, as the parties say, it seems that the other areas where they're going to have to be about 40% cuts in departmental spending and or major tax rises, how realistic, I know that that's what the parties want to project, but how really realistic is it to get 70 billion off the current deficit and get it to Labour's proposals of 30 billion or 100 billion off to get to Conservatives or somewhere in between, which is where you are?
A lot of big hooses.
Yes, a lot of big houses. I mean, even though we've not cut the deficit to the extent that we wanted to in this Parliament, we have actually delivered on the cuts that we said we were going to do in order to try and get to the right position, and other factors have had an influence. I mean, the European economy, for instance, has had quite a dramatic impact on it. So we were able to follow through on what we said we were going to do, and we were quite, I remember getting criticised heavily from, particularly in Sheffield, for some of the withdrawal of funding that had already been committed. So we were pretty bold at that stage and followed through on exactly what we were said we were going to do. So I think it can be done. I think it's realistic. I think how far the Conservatives are going is really beginning to cut right into the bone to the level of cuts that they want to try and achieve. So I think it's perfectly realistic. We have got a list of that we've spelt out so far, and more of that will come as the election approaches, because people want for us to be as frank as we can in advance, because you don't know everything that you can do, but you do know an awful lot, and I think that will come out as the election approaches, and we already have done some of it in terms of tax relief on pensions and other tax rises, as well as some of the cuts that we've spelt out. So we are, there's a kind of an edgy kind of publication of these proposals, because sometimes if you get too far ahead of the other parties, then you can be left high and dry. But that it will come as the election approaches, because people are asking the very questions that you're asking. In terms of immigration, very tricky. People do think that some people think that immigration is not under control. If you are a low-income worker and you see somebody coming along and working alongside you, you can feel the pressure. Who's maybe come from Eastern Europe or elsewhere. The big argument to make is we could not do without the immigration that we've achieved, that we have. in the United Kingdom, doctors, nurses, the skilled workers that we get, but also the agricultural workers. I mean, if you go up to Kettle Produce in Fife, you know, it's dominated by Eastern Europeans, and they're very, very effective workers. And we could not survive. The industries would really struggle if we did not have that workforce right here in Scotland. And that's the case we need to make, that it's in our economic interests to have the immigration that we have now. It needs to be balanced, it needs to be controlled. We need to make sure that we've got the public services that can cope with the ebbs and flows, that we've not got schools that are bursting at the seams and doctor surgeries that are bursting the seams without the proper resource to go with it. And that's the pressure that they feel in some parts of England, particularly in about Lincolnshire and so on. They do feel that, and I understand the issues. The reaction should not, however, be to pull up the drawbridge and say we don't want anybody else, because our economy would really struggle to survive under those circumstances. You know, we've also got an issue about the demographics. We have an ageing population, as we all know, and we do need more taxpayers to be able to pay for the public services that we need in order to maintain the standard of services that we've become accustomed to make sure we've got that balanced, sustainable economy. So we need it. We need their skills in very high skill areas, but also in terms of agriculture. And I think these are great people that come to the country. I mean, the work rate. I mean, if you're going to uproot your family from another part of the world and come over here to work, you've got something about you. You know, you're not there to take from that country. You're there to give from that to that country. And I think we should be celebrating that, whilst also recognising the pressures that some people feel. I think we also need to reintroduce the exit controls, so we know who's in and out of the country, because currently we don't seem to have a full understanding of that, and despite repeated attempts to get the Home Office to reintroduce those exit checks, it's not happened. So we need to give confidence that we understand and we feel the pressure that some people feel, but at the same time we've got to celebrate what immigration means. I mean, we are probably all of us in this room have descended from immigrants at some point or another. So we need to recognise that that's what this country is, and it's grown in its strength because of that, and not be ashamed to say so.
Thank you. Let's squeeze in the last two, if they can be quick, please. Lady there, and anyone else for one final quick question? No more? Okay, we'll make that the last one then.
Just another issue that's not been, Katie Dixon from Scottish Land and Estates. Another issue that's not been discussed tonight is housing. It's very important to a lot of our members. I'm just wondering if you could tell us what your position is on the private rented housing consultation that's just recently closed.
Sorry, the private rented...
Housing consultation.
Sorry, remind me. Explain a bit more.
The proposals are to create secure private tenancies.
Oh, right, sorry. Yeah, this is the Shelter Scotland proposals to increase the standards, the rights. I think that's right. Yeah, no, they are. I think they originated from Shelter Scotland to make sure they've got an unequal status almost with social housing in the private rented sector. No, I understand that. We do need to build an awful lot more houses. We need to make sure we build houses of a decent standard as well. And sometimes in the private rented sector, the standards have not been as good as they need to be. The rents are far too high. And some people argue it's all part of the housing benefit system that we've managed to create that subsidises that private sector. So we need to make sure we get that balance right, but we do need also to incentivise the private sector to make sure that it's a worthwhile area to invest in. So there's no point in increasing the standard to such a level that everybody finds it a not particularly attractive area to invest within. So we've got to get that balance right. And sometimes, and this probably comes back to the question from earlier on, sometimes we only think about the one side of the balance sheet of the equation of the debate. I mean, we did a debate on the economy last week in Parliament, and apart from John Swinney, myself, Gavin Brown, I don't think anybody else really talked about business. They all talked about social standards, about living wages. So they actually didn't really embrace the economic agenda, and that's sometimes what happens in the Scottish Parliament. They don't think about the other side of the equation, the consequential effects of the decisions that we might take. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the Scottish Government's proposals, but we need to make sure that we've got them proper evidenced so that we're not disincentivising the private sector from investing in private housing, because the social sector can't do it all by itself.
Thank you. Well, I think we should probably draw things to a close here and to allow Ray a few seconds to pop up and say his final words. While he's doing that, I wonder if you'd like to join me all in saying thank you very much to Willie in the usual way.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. My final words are pretty brief. Just to thank Martin Potter for his expert chairing of the discussion, and of course to thank Willie Rennie for his very interesting speech and for answering most of the questions as frankly as he did. So can I now invite you to continue the discussion in the foyer, where we're happy to buy you a drink. One last reminder, the next in the series is Ruth Davidson, a week and a day from tonight, the 21st. So if you haven't already registered, please do that as soon as you can. Thank you very much indeed.